Hello and welcome. My name is Charles Wright. In this video, we'll be exploring some educational theories we can use when designing content to help students not feel overwhelmed in the classroom. The premise of the cognitive load theory states people have a limited amount of working memory. So if we're teaching a topic, we have to be aware of these limitations while also minimizing distractions. The two types of memory we'll be dealing with are working memory and long-term memory. Working memory capacity is limited to about 4 new pieces of information and about 5 to 9 total pieces of information at a time. However, long-term memory is basically unlimited. So even though working memory is very limited, once we transfer the information to long-term memory, it tends to stay there. There are 3 load conditions in the cognitive load theory. Intrinsic load is how complex the material is for the individual learner, caused by interacting elements and the learner's previous experience with the material. A problem with a car could be very simple to deal with for a mechanic, but could be very complicated for someone who doesn't work on cars because of all of the interacting parts that could be causing the problem. Extraneous cognitive load are any distractions in the way that the content is presented. So if the person is talking too fast, or the text is hard to read, or the video doesn't match up with the audio, these distractions take up precious working memory space we need for the content that we're presenting. Germane cognitive load is the effective cognitive load on the learner when you add together intrinsic and extraneous load conditions. The cognitive theory of multimedia premise states students learn better through images and words compared to only words alone. And active learners go through 3 steps to process new information. The 3 assumptions of the cognitive theory of multimedia are the dual channel assumption, which says that people learn better through words and pictures than through words alone. This is where the term multimedia comes from in the name of the theory. Words and images in any form constitute multimedia. Limited capacity is referring to the working memory and is the same as the cognitive load theory we just talked about. Working memory is limited to 4 new pieces of information and about 5 to 9 total pieces of information. Active processing says that learners select the most important words and images between sensory and working memory. Then, they organize those words and images in the working memory, and finally, they bring the words and images together with prior knowledge to integrate the learning into long-term memory. Both of these theories offer some guidance on how to create material that does not overwhelm the learner. Let's discuss some principles for reducing extraneous processing in multimedia learning. Extraneous processing is any cognitive processing related to the way the content is being presented, which means students have to do more work and use up more working memory to understand the content we're trying to teach them. We'll explore signaling, coherence, and temporal contiguity. The signaling principle states that people learn more deeply from presentations or multimedia that have cues or signals to help them organize the information and make the most important information stand out. Signaling can be anything from arrows and circles to highlighting, underlining, or bolding text. If we're teaching a complicated piece of software that may be new to a student, all of the buttons and choices can be overwhelming. But if we add some signaling to show the students the steps we're talking about, they can more easily follow along without as much extraneous processing. The coherence principle states that people learn more deeply from presentations or multimedia that do not have extraneous material included in them. Sometimes teachers have a tendency to add or show material they find interesting or fun, even though it may only be tangentially related to the topic. Research shows that adding this extraneous material uses up valuable working memory in students. A slide like this can be overwhelming because of all the images and text the students need to process. Even though the instructor felt all this information was important or fun and pertained to the topic, The student is not sure what to look at or what they should be reading first. In contrast, a slide like this gives the students the information they need without the extraneous overload of the previous slide. The temporal contiguity principle states that people learn more deeply from presentations or multimedia when the visual and narration are presented simultaneously. If we have Photoshop up on the screen, then we should be talking about Photoshop. Sometimes we forget what content we have up on the screen when a student asks a question. For example, if we're here talking about Photoshop and a student asks about the printer settings in InDesign so they can print out their project, sometimes as instructors, we keep Photoshop open and answer that question. This creates extraneous processing because the visual on the screen doesn't match the question we're talking about. Instead, the instructor should switch over to the software they're answering the question on so other students can follow along. As instructors, we also have to contend with students' prior knowledge, and sometimes that prior knowledge is incorrect. Refutation text can help students correct their misconceptions, and research shows the use of this tool can help the new information stick. First, we identify the misconception, then we refute the misconception, and then we explain the correct information. Now let's apply these principles to a lesson introducing design terms to first-year students. First, let's define the terms we will use in our critique. A line is a mark that connects 2 points. Lines can be curved or straight, jagged or playful. In design, lines can divide content, underline words, or repeat to create patterns. If we begin to join these lines together, we create shapes. Shapes can be triangles, squares, circles, but can also be organic, abstract, or symbols. Color helps us to identify objects, evoke emotion, or helps us to highlight or call out elements in the design. Value is the relative lightness or darkness of an object. When we have 2 or more objects, we can judge the contrast of the 2 objects. Contrast is the value difference between objects. If objects have very different values, one is very light, one is very dark, we would say there's a lot of contrast between those 2 objects. Space is the area between elements in a design. Elements can be crowded together or spread far apart, both which communicate something about the design. Negative space is the term we use for intentional empty space. Hierarchy or emphasis is the order in which the viewer sees each element in the design. As designers, we want to control how the viewer sees each component of the layout, so they look at the most important element first, then the next most important element next, and so on down the line. Let's look at some examples so we can apply these terms. We'll start with this Bauhaus poster from the 30s. Right away, we see the black letters because of their contrast against the background. When we talk about hierarchy, I like to say, what did you see first? Then what did you see second? And so on. I see the black letters first, then the colorful shapes, and then I read the poster's content. It's important to pay attention to how your eye moves through the design as we look at these. Next, let's explore this See America poster designed by Dux Alexander. The poster primarily uses shape and value differences to create the image. The poster has strong linear elements used to divide the space and make the shapes of the mountains. Color is used sparingly, but draws our attention to the areas it's used. There's a lot of contrast between the trees and the figure of the horse, which makes the figure stand out. Next, let's look at this Vertigo poster designed by Saul Bass. The first thing I notice is the red color. Color can communicate strong emotions. This movie is a psychological thriller, and I think the color communicates that idea. Changing the color to a calming light blue wouldn't communicate the same message. The poster also uses circular lines to create a pattern that directs our attention to the middle of the composition. Lastly, The poster uses contrast to make the people and the words stand out. Black against white is the greatest amount of contrast possible. Lastly, let's look at this Jurassic Park poster designed by Chip Kidd. The poster uses color sparingly to bring our attention to the upper half and read the name of the movie. But then he leaves all this negative space, so we're forced to read the tagline, "An adventure 65 million years in the making." Even though the text is not large, the empty space around it makes it important and makes the viewer want to read it. I hope this introduction to some of the design elements gives you a better idea of how we will use these concepts in class to critique work. Some people think graphic design is all about the software. This isn't true. From the examples we just explored, we can see design is about larger concepts that can be applied in multiple media. Thanks for watching. I hope this short video gives you some research-backed theories on how we can create content that does not overwhelm the learner and create stronger learning connections.